probably as a society, we need to begin to change that mind shift and understand that if you want things, you want them according to certain parameters. So I want them quickly, I want choice, I want availability, etc. That's going to cost.
A warm welcome to Geopolcast, the new podcast from WTW exploring geopolitics and its impact. My name is Elisabeth Braw. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm also a columnist for foreign policy and political Europe, where I focus on the busy intersection between geopolitics and globalization. In each episode of Geopolcast, I'm joined by two experts with whom I discuss subjects that matter to people in business and, in fact, to everyone in the globalized economy. And today, I'm delighted to be joined by two senior practitioners with enormous expertise in the complex world of supply chains. Enrico Savio is Managing Director of Leonardo International, a subsidiary that's fully controlled by the Leonardo Group. Before joining Leonardo in 2019 as Chief Strategist, Enrico served for over a decade as Chief of Staff and then Deputy Director of Italy's DIS, which is the Dipartimento delle Informazioni per la Sicurezza, and made him the Deputy Director of National Intelligence, the way the Italian system is set up. In his current role as Managing Director of Leonardo International, Enrico is in charge of managing a number of subsidiaries worldwide that are tasked with industrial maintenance and repairs. And he also manages contacts with Leonardo's partners during the extent of any given contract, and indeed with its clients as well. Now, that's a lot of moving parts, especially considering the extreme complexity of modern military equipment. And even more so considering that lots of countries are increasing their defense spending and buying more military equipment. So there's more activity in lots of countries in buying military equipment, and that also means more manufacturing for companies like Leonardo. And an efficient supply chain is key to making sure that government defense spending actually results in the equipment that these governments are trying to procure. Now, Frederick Gentile is WTW's Director of Risk Engagement and has worked on all manner of risk for many years, decades, I think it's safe to say, Frederick. So welcome, Enrico, and welcome, Frederick.
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
Enrico, I want to start with you since you look after globe-spanning supply chains. And what is clearly a challenge already, given the complexity of supply chains, is becoming even more difficult now that geopolitical tensions are rising. So I'm keen to hear from you, how are Leonardo's supply chains structured? What sort of countries are involved? And how do your parts travel between these different countries?
Given the international footprint we have, whose example is we are providers of major civil producing companies of parts, and the supply chain it be aligned between the production phase, the transfer phase, and the final assembly phase, which is quite a challenge in itself. And this, let's say, is framed in a context which sees 85% of our turnaround placed worldwide in more than 140 countries.
So that's 85% of all your manufacturing activity is conducted outside Italy.
Yes, correct. Yes, 85% is outside Italy, and that makes us one of the 10 more relevant global players in aerospace and defense. And to keep up with that challenge, we need to be performing in the way I just explained.
And if I can just ask you about the realities of those disruptions that you mentioned. I think everybody remembers the disruption caused by COVID. And that was, in a sense, a wake-up call for lots of companies that had, for example, be single sourcing, and all of a sudden that single source was no longer available. But so we have the risk of another pandemic. We also have the risk of climate-related disruption, and that risk is increasing. We also have geopolitical tension that can cause disruption to supply chains, either on the production side or on the transportation side. So again, I'm not going to ask you to divulge any company secrets, but where are the vulnerable points for a company like Leonardo? Leonardo at the moment in getting the supplies to where you need them to be at any given moment? And indeed in assembling your extremely complex products.
Yes, it's a very, let's say, targeted question, and I'm not a scholar or an economist, but based upon the experiences of the past years, we say that the pandemics kind of mark a turning point in the overall strategic approach to procurement as well as to management of supply chains. Prior to that, we were all in a way embedded in a sort of globalized feeling and a globalized mechanism, which brought us to pursue economic advantages. So the cheaper the sources of procurement were, the easier was to place some, let's say, source of supply from that area of the world. The post-pandemics, as well as the wars that are going on, are bringing us, theorists used to say, toward the deglobalization in a way, so bringing back, reshoring in a way, as they say, some of the capacities. I think that the extremes never focus on the target. Maybe the truth is always in the middle. So it's an appropriate and balanced approach which we need to pursue in order to maintain, again, autonomy of procurement and independence of choices. The more you are dependent on a given source, the less you may be responding to not only to the market needs, but also to your country's needs, since there's no sector nowadays that is not, in a way, fully integrated into the capacity of a country to sustain itself on a longer-term basis. So from food to agriculture to electronics to components, semiconductors, whatever you want to take, it's not only a matter of defense materials, it's an overall strategic approach that we need to maintain, also because we have seen the strategization, if I may use this bad wording in English, of the energetic sector, of the communication sector. How strategic are they? And we see it happening every day. Look at the event in Finland, for instance, which took place a few days ago. This gives you a clear answer to that.
Absolutely. And this is also, I think, a changing mindset for companies that are in the consumer product business or in, as you say, in energy or telecommunications. Companies that have been thinking of themselves as global operators, they are realizing that they have some sort of responsibility for the countries in which they are based. Frederick, I want to turn around Enrico's points and ask you about that reality as well. Companies trying to re-examine their supply chains, because it can't be assumed that the ease with which they've been able to manufacture and transport their products can continue. And in fact, it's already seeing, as discussed, more disruptions. And I think the first acute reminder of that was Fukushima, the accident. That, it was a tsunami that turned into a nuclear accident, obviously, and a local company making that sort of shimmery or glittery paint that goes on cars had to close, which meant that cars could not be finished. The cars that needed that paint could not be finished, and because automotive companies had been single sourcing that pigment. So, Frederick, if we look at today, what sort of risks are you seeing grow in supply chains, and which other ones are likely to emerge?
Okay, I think that's an interesting question. In terms of risks, obviously the geopolitical instability is an obvious one. You've already alluded to that in your opening remarks, Elisabeth. I think there's an increasing level of concern around the stability of suppliers and the territories that they're operating within, and how nationalistic sort of policies can affect their trading approach. I think there's concern also around the solvency of some of the smaller suppliers, particularly as you start going deeper into the supply chain. And then added to that, or compounding that, is almost a sliding scale of reduced visibility as you go deeper into the supply chain. I think there's been a shift over the last sort of 5-10 years, and companies generally have a reasonably good visibility of their tier 1 and possibly tier 2 suppliers. Anything beyond that starts to get very, very difficult.
On that note, Frederick, is it even possible for main manufacturer, let's say an automotive company or another company manufacturing complex products, do they even have any way of knowing all the companies in their supply chain? As you said, beyond first tier, tier one, it becomes difficult, but second tier they may know, but third tier, even fourth tier, do they even have a chance of knowing who is in that supply chain?
I think they certainly have a chance of knowing. If we take the term resilience, there's an expression that's been attached to resilience. Resilience has a cost. So it all really depends on how much they're prepared to invest in understanding who their tier 3, tier 4 suppliers are. There are companies that purport to specialize in being able to break down the supply chain and give that level of data. But again, it depends on how much you're prepared to invest in terms of financial and resourcing, etc. And as I said, over time, that knowledge is slowly increasing. Of course, the other risk is clearly cyber. So in terms of the supply chain and the ability to move goods from A to B, C, etc., there is an acceptance and an awareness now that these supply chains in their complexity have an increased vulnerability. And so going back to Enrico's point about reshoring, that to a limited extent begins to address that point. Reshoring isn't just about eliminating the cyber risk, but it's certainly a contribution to reducing it. So I think those are the sort of the big risks. The other one, of course, longer term, and there is a discussion here about short-termism versus long-termism, but the longer term is the reliability of supply of raw products from territories that can be affected by climate change, etc., and the availability of raw materials. So that's a longer term consideration as well. So I don't know whether that answers the questions out. This are the bigger picture risks.
It certainly does answer the question. And Enrico, if I can go back to you, you mentioned, and now Frederick also mentioned, raw materials. And it struck me, or occurred to me that with climate change causing more devastation, we could face a serious disruption in raw material availability. And so on that point, what does contingency planning look like for Leonardo's supply chains today, bearing in mind all these different risks we have discussed? And is your company adding that cost that Frederick just mentioned of trying to know every company in your supply chain and perhaps adding duplicates to avoid single source vulnerability?
Yes, thank you, Elisabeth. It's an equation, and actually that has to be resolved in a way, because you have, on the one hand, the profit and loss structure of our, let's say, Western economic-oriented model. On the other side, you have the need for diversification, which implies additional costs. You have to invest, you have to diversify. The reshoring is a costly process. We cannot think and give it for granted. You have to delocalize, relocalize, and that's the reshoring in a row. In front of an overall, which was very well described by Frederick, of an overall complexity which is very difficult to navigate. There are events, actually, the history of mankind has been difficult to navigate, as we may admit nowadays, because we always think in our times that we are facing additional complexities. I don't know if ancient Troy complexity was not there. I expect it was there in a way, but in order to answer your question, it's a set of measures. It's not a one-way solution in our view. So Leonardo is approaching that in terms of, first of all, HR. You have to develop skills, you have to develop competence and invest on the human capital so that you may organize that human capital, which is phase 2, in a way that if a pandemic comes in, we maintain the production continuity at our helicopters factories, because we organize the people in batches of 8. So if one of the 8 was hit by the virus, the entire set was going away and the other 8 were coming in, which is of course costly because it takes time to organize, it takes time to keep people on hold while the others are working. But this will allow you at the end of the day to maintain continuity into the production phase. So this is HR. Processes, I said, organization is comes to follow, and also a continuing planning activity. You have to plan and replan and readapt. Like in the strategic view of, let's say, of human activities in general, it's a circular process, never stops, and always takes nourishment from its previous phase and foresees and goes to the following one. If we live in a paradigmatic way and wait for, let's say, and follow a sort of quantitative approach, I'm afraid we can be fooled by reality. So it's a continuing process that we need to adapt to the situation. That's how we survived and maintained production during the COVID era. And this is also why how we are reacting to some, let's say, needs that may come from the military domain in relation to the crisis that's going on at the moment.
I guess this is the question for both of you. The reality of this is that having to make supply chains more resilient is increased costs for the eventual buyer, whether that be a consumer or a government or a business, right? I mean, it is inevitable.
Yes, because the equation is quite complicated on that side. So there has to be more, let's say, attitude from the market, from the buyer's side, but also it's a push to optimize, because the digital era is providing us with loads of capacities. Imagine we are making a huge investment in terms of digital twinning of our platforms. Now, imagine what it means managing from a distance our helicopters in Australia through the digital twin and guaranteeing MROs services from a distance, and also guaranteeing, for instance, proactive, preemptive maintenance programs, which on let's say, machinery in general can be assessed, studied, and managed very, very accurately. You know that a certain part is a number of hours prior to becoming exposed to a failure or malfunctioning in general. And then if you preset that and maintain that, that will be, let's say, you can recover resources from that. So we take advantage of the digital solutions. So on the one side, take advantage of that means, of course, investing into that. So we have supercomputer capacities enacted right now, and we put them at disposal of the supply chain and the market to follow. On the other hand, it's a process that may be continuously rearranged, because situations may arise where the client asks for more, and for more in a very short time period. So maybe also a reflection, and this is something, let's say, we are thinking about warehousing and how to manage warehouses as well as spare parts, because nowadays it's driven only by an economic principle. You produce when you receive an order. Then this will make you not ready if an additional demand is hanging out there and you can't respond to that. So that's another issue. So maybe we have to go back a bit, if not to the ancient times where you used to stock huge warehousing in order to supply the typical Fordist chain of production in sequence. But it's a mix which, with the added value of the digital capacities, can be thoroughly managed. Also because if you put too much in the warehouse, these materials will decay at a certain point. So you have a decay management, which is also subdued to other regulations, economics involved, and so on. So a balance must be, I'd say, drawn in order to maintain a balance. And at the end of the day, the diversification of the sources is key, is paramount for whatever material, in my experience.
Just to sort of build on Enrico's point, the more stock you have in the warehouse, the more capital you have tied up, and that's money. Money costs money. So that's another, component to be added on further down the line. And I think just a couple of other quick points to build on Enrico's extremely interesting commentary there. I believe that, if I can use the term, the just-in-time bubble that we've lived in the last 10, 15 years has been blown up, and there's now probably burst. And we're now into a just-in-case bubble, and that's, we're sort of developing that. And I think it's interesting to note that not only have costs simply been passed on, and we're seeing them at retail level, for example. So I'm talking about B2C. But actually, companies and retailers in particular are really slightly more sort of transparent about it. I'm sorry, our costs have gone up and we have to pass them on. And that's the way it is. And probably as a society, we need to begin to change that mind shift and understand that if you want things, you want them according to certain parameters. So I want them quickly, I want choice, I want availability, etc. That's going to cost.
It's going to cost, and if actually a question for both of you. From my perspective, all kinds of products have been artificially cheap because we have lived through 3 decades of just exceptionally favorable manufacturing and transportation conditions, and that was always going to be an anomaly, and we are sort of leaving that extremely advantageous era at the moment, slowly, but it is happening, and so we are returning to higher prices. So my question for both of you is, do you think companies can actually make a virtue out of necessity if they have to move from single sourcing, if they have to move to refashion their supply chains so that their suppliers are particular countries, i.e. friendshoring, that it's going to be more expensive, not just in terms of wages and so forth, but of course the investment in building those new facilities and indeed the new supply chains. So the price will be more expensive from that point. But do you think there is the virtue in this? Could it be that companies can then tell their customers, prospective customers, and indeed shareholders, we are prepared, we are resilient. Other companies may have cheaper products, but their supply chains are vulnerable, whereas we have shored up our supply chains, and as a result, and indeed manufacturing, as a result, we are more expensive, but we will be able to deliver under circumstances that our competitors will not be able to deliver. So maybe starting with you, Enrico, and then you, Frederick.
Yes, thank you, Elisabeth. Well, actually, it's a matter of competitive storytelling in a way. So to transform the necessity in a virtue. There's a motto in Italian which says that hunger draws the wolf out of the woods. So I mean, you need to make a virtue out of whatever contingency and situation you may face, but you need to get prepared. So maybe we lost some time in the past living in the bubble that were growing, and then in a way cuddling us and feeling us comfortable with that and being reassured by that. Now, many of those uncertainties have transformed themselves into uncertainties. And these uncertainties need to be faced through the prism of competition as well, because our economic model is based upon economic profit. So there's no doubt about that. There may be the chance for a revision, for a new approach to that. So the profit and loss, as tough as it is, may be reconsidered into that. But it's a long time evolution which is required, because we start, and it's in this way is a vicious circle, not a virtuous one, because if you start from the financial, then the economic the industrial will have repercussions, and it's a complex system once again. So you need to, let's say, move it accordingly and not separately in a way, acknowledging and recognizing on the other side virtues and values in a different manner than the past. Now, I don't want to appear a philosopher, but I think these are the very, fundamentals and basics of an economic system. And the industrial structure is built on top of it. So there's a demand and there's an offer. That's the point. So in the aerospace and defense industry, there is more will to spend, because the entities that spend the money are safeguarding a generalistic interest, which is national interest, which is, of course, defense, and in a way, the independence and autonomy of a sovereign state. So there is more, let's say, goodwill into undertaking long-term programs, which is a feature of the defense industry, as well as expensive programs, which doesn't mean that those markets don't care about costs. In a way, it's a different story, because you need to have survival capacities. Once again, efficiency and effectiveness into those capacities, and this requires money, of course, and resilience as well of those systems. And then the cyber by design, which is something that is no longer an add-on to pre-existing technologies, but it's something that has to start with the new technologies, the new platforms, sixth generation platforms for aerial platforms, I mean, and I'm talking about platforms, not aircraft, because it's going to be a system of systems, something much different. Of course, will be cyber secure by design, of course, will be resilient in any given ECM, electromagnetic emissions and environment, contested, semi-contested environments, distant engagement. So these are strategic concepts that will be transformed into industrial applications, which will require a lot of materials and it's significant, meaningful, robust supply chain behind it. Yes. So there's a lot to be thought about.
And on that note, Frederick, I'll give you the last word. Enrico mentioned materials, and it seems to me that the system we have built up of supply chains where companies specialize isn't the challenge for manufacturers or a top company in any supply chain pyramid. Isn't the challenge there that, yes, they may realize that they need to move away from single sourcing if they know who all the companies in their supply chains are. They may realize that they need to have more resilient supply chains. But are there even enough suppliers out there for them to expand to? Or will we have to wait for years for these companies to materialize that can join these supply chains and make them more resilient?
Yeah, that is an interesting point. I don't have the answer to that because it'll vary by sector. There are sectors where that single supplier is for the moment the only option for whatever reason, either by way of peculiarity of materials or intellectual property or whatever. But what I've seen over the last 2 or 3 years is that organizations, manufacturers, are becoming more and more inventive in the way that they're looking at their production processes, etc. So where it's not possible to either increase stocks for reasons that Enrico's already covered, where there's only one supplier, they will also consider the possibility of adapting their manufacturing processes to almost compensate, a bit like the human body. When one part of our body doesn't work properly, the other one will compensate, and you balance it out. So I think organizations are doing that. What the other point I wanted to make very quickly was that traditionally finance, production, sales have been almost the highest priorities on board agendas. What I think is happening now is that supply chain is very much on the board list of priorities, and therefore is getting a lot more airtime. And if you are already under pressure economically, commercially or other, to keep your margins up, the last thing that you want is a breakdown in the supply chain, because that really will start hurting you reputationally, brand share, profitability, etc. And therefore companies will give an appropriate level of attention and resource and investment to answering the question, how do I make sure my supply chain guarantees me continuity? Because I can't afford to stop. So you as the supply chain lead, you as the management team, I don't care how you do it, find me the solutions and do it cost effectively.
That is so true. Companies can't afford to stop, and this is why they are willing to spend more money, as both you, Enrico, and you, Frederick, have outlined. And I'm afraid our time is up, so it's time for me to thank Enrico Savio and Frederick Gentile, and thank you to our producer, Robin Pegg, and above all, thank you all for listening to Geopolcast. In upcoming episodes, we'll examine ESG and much else. To get the episodes as soon as they are released, make sure to subscribe to Geopolcast. You can find us via your usual podcast players, and please recommend us to your friends and colleagues. Until next time.
Thank you for joining us for this WTW podcast featuring the latest perspectives on the intersection of people, capital, and risk. For more information, visit the Insights section of WTWCO.com. Willis Towers Watson offers insurance-related services through its appropriately licensed and authorized companies in each country in which Willis Towers Watson operates. For further authorization and regulatory details about our Willis Towers Watson legal entities operating in your country, please refer to our Willis Towers Watson website. It is a regulatory requirement for us to consider our local licensing requirements. The information given in this podcast is believed to be accurate at the date of publication. This information may have subsequently changed or have been superseded and should not be relied upon to be accurate or suitable after this date. This podcast offers a general overview of its subject matter. It does not necessarily address every aspect of its subject or every product available in the market, and we disclaimer all liability to the fullest extent permitted by law. It is not intended to be and should not be used to replace specific advice relating to individual situations, and we do not offer, and this should not be seen as legal, accounting, or tax advice. If you intend to take any action or make any decision on the basis of the content of this podcast, you should first seek specific advice from an appropriate professional. Some of the information in this podcast may be compiled from third-party sources we consider to be reliable. However, we do not guarantee and are not responsible for the accuracy of such. The views expressed are not necessarily those of Willis Towers Watson. Copyright Willis Towers Watson 2023. All rights reserved.